to know something that's never been successful ever? How about trying to revive one of the worst trends from the 80s and 90s? Celebrity-based cartoons almost always suck. Hammerman, Camp Candy, the Mr. T cartoon. Yeah, the only actual time I've seen this work is with the Mike Tyson cartoon. When the only thing notable about your show's premise is that it's based on some random famous person, that's usually not enough to sustain a show. Which is why 90% of the time these shows bomb. As a celebrity, you may tend to think you're larger than life, but actually, you alone cannot sustain a show. And that brings us to Wild Grinders, the brainchild of Rob Dyrdek. You may look at this show at first glance, and what immediately jumps out at you is the awful animation. You might think it jumps out at you for how awful it is, and yes, it is awful looking, but the real reason most of you are taken aback by looking at this hideous show is because you're probably experiencing deja vu. This show looks suspiciously like the Nut Shack. Yeah guys, they thought they could take that style and turn it into a kid-friendly show on Nickelodeon. The show infamous for being one of the most cheaply produced, hideous-looking, and most disgusting show of the 2000s. Its style was reworked for a show for children. You don't need me to tell you that for a show about something like skateboarding, you need really fluid animation, which this show does not have. You also need to have people that look like people, and skateboards that look like skateboards, and buildings that look like buildings, and I think you get my point. One of the first episodes I watched to prepare for this was the episode that comes up when you search the show on YouTube, and it is something special. There are loads of animation problems in the show, and so I'm going to pull from that episode to show you what I mean, since it's not only the easiest footage to pull from, but it's also one of the worst episodes. Let's look at this shot of them skating on the moon. Notice how the moon is in a crescent shape despite that not being the shape of the moon at all. I didn't think I'd have to explain this to adults, but let me reiterate. The moon is a sphere no matter what phase it's in. And that's not even the worst part about this. There is no scaling. These characters look huge when you compare them to the size of the moon, which I guess is fine if that's the only way this crappy animation can show these characters skating on the moon, but not when you have the dog look way smaller than it should later on in the episode. And the animation isn't even the worst thing about that particular episode. The plots in this show, much like the Nut Shack, are what reality might sort of feel like in a dream, and also drunk and high at the same time. The episode where they skate on the moon is about the main characters trying to get adopted by a rich couple so they can afford to buy new skateboards, and it makes the main characters, especially Rob, look really unlikable. And at the end of the episode, their money and new skateboards get taken away with zero explanation as to why this happens. There's no in-plot reason at all. Like, I'd expect you to at least give me a reason, even if it's a bad one. And for no reason, I'm going to end this right now and go straight to number 4. I wanted to avoid clogging up this list with shows that are too similar, but then I realized that wouldn't do justice to how similar Nick's shows have become. Nickelodeon has a lot of cartoons whose concepts are basically copy-pasted from other shows they've done. This isn't the last entry that's going to be talking about that either. However, to bring to light just how much of a problem this kind of thing is, I'm going to make number 4 a double entry, where I talk about Sanjay and Craig and Breadwinners at the same time. Because they're so similar anyway, they might as well both populate the same entry on the list. And in fact, this could have been a triple entry with Fanboy and Chum Chum if I really wanted to make it one. However, I happen to think that both of these shows are a notch worse than that. Fanboy and Chum Chum has a bit more substance than either of these. Let's start with Breadwinners. Breadwinners was a show based on a pilot that Nick execs found on YouTube. Yeah. It's about ducks that look nothing like ducks, delivering bread to other ducks that actually do look like ducks because they're just live-action ducks. Okay, even that was confusing. I don't care what kind of show you're trying to make. When you have a certain species looking one way, you cannot have that same species in an entirely different art style without an explanation as to why. But that's not even the main thing I'm talking about. If you boil it all down, this show is essentially about two douchebags going around and annoying people. Not just the other characters, but the audience as well. And that's the problem. Like, a major problem. But since I've mentioned it in part 1, I won't go on that tirade again. And with Sanjay and Craig, it's the exact same thing, except with an Indian kid and a snake instead of 2 ducks. The sad thing is that they could have made this work. Regular show is how you do this kind of thing correctly. But alas, we're stuck with 3 very similar shows on Nickelodeon, and not once could they get the same concept right. Jimmy Neutron is one of the most iconic Nickelodeon shows. Yeah, you know this entry's gonna be Planet Sheen. And why would it not be? It's one of the most derivative shows I've ever seen. And it makes me wonder why they didn't just reboot Jimmy Neutron if they wanted to do it again. Sure, that's a bad idea in its own right, but it's better than this. If you wanted to give Sheen his own show, why did you put Carl in it? Yeah, I know this character isn't really Carl, but he might as well be. And at that point, why not just have another Jimmy? And at that point, why not just reboot Jimmy Neutron? And I think you get my point. But honestly, it's true. If you have Sheen, and you basically have Carl, and you don't have Jimmy, it's just like you wanted to get rid of Jimmy. There is a major puzzle piece missing there. And by extension, you've broken the entire formula that made Jimmy Neutron work in the first place. Jimmy Neutron without Jimmy Neutron is just Sheen being a moron and Carl being Carl, without a straight man to bounce off those personalities. And let me make one thing clear. By no means am I calling Jimmy himself a blank slate, but he is the main character of Jimmy Neutron for a reason. Dexter's Laboratory from Dee Dee's perspective would not work in any way. It's just one of those things, you know? There are certain protagonists that work, and certain ones that don't. And when the key source of the humor in your show shifts to being the main character, something has gone wrong. It's why The Patrick Show doesn't work, and it's why Cars 2 is one of Pixar's worst movies. It's the same principle with Planet Sheen. You know, part of me wonders if the whole Butch Hartman drama only happened to distract from his later shows, because losing your touch is one thing, but the way Tough Puppy went and how Fairly Odd Parents ended and the quality that this show ended up being, this guy fell harder than Dan Schneider in terms of the quality of his shows. And of course, we don't even need to bring up both men's public reputation later in their careers. With Bunsen as a Beast, I've seen reboots that have done more to vary up the original style, even using the same characters, than Bunsen as a Beast does with the typical Butch Hartman formula. I said Planet Sheen was one of the most derivative shows I've ever seen because this is the most derivative show I've ever seen. Sure, there may be nothing that exists that's entirely original, but Bunsen as a Beast is still egregious in its lack of originality. Late season's Fairly Odd Parents and this have almost the exact same humor and the exact same plot structure, which is to say, there is none. And then, that's when you realize, this show is very conceptually similar to My Gym Partner's a Monkey, and Mikey even looks like Adam from that show. But this show is even worse than its lack of originality, because it never stops to have a moment of quiet. I got headaches every time I watched an episode to prepare making this video. The characters are loud and annoying, worse than anything I've seen. And since in the joke department they don't want to do anything but that, this show is what we're left with. And it's a shame, because there's still something I consider to be worse than this. For dishonorable mentions, I only have 2. There were only 2 shows I thought merited consideration for this list that didn't make it, which is honestly fewer than I thought there would be. The first one is The Legend of Korra. The Legend of Korra is certainly a show I don't like, but due to the scrutiny that the Avatar franchise has deservedly earned, this show also deserves credit for the things it does right, and it is a notch above the shows I put on this list. My other dishonorable mention is Robot and Monster. Because this show is about 2 characters with the blank and blank title template, that meant it had to be in this list, right? Actually, no. This is what you get when Fanboy and Chum Chum and Breadwinners become too mellow. This show is trying way too hard to be funny, but it's so vanilla in the way it goes about doing that I have a hard time getting any enjoyment out of it. But even still, it didn't manage to annoy me as much as the other shows, so it's not on the list. Right, now that's that, let's get to number 1. You know, in hindsight, it's kind of amazing, after talking about all these shows, what ended up being number 1. It's amazing because it's the show that takes the most vanilla way of doing all these cartoon premises that get done over and over and doesn't do anything creative. Yeah, that's what makes me angrier than all the annoyance, all the regurgitation, and all the low production values I've talked about thus far. And while, yeah, this show has all those too, it's even worse because they managed to care as little as possible while doing all those things. They couldn't even bother to get the character design of the main character right. Otis is supposed to be a male in this show, but he has udders. Bulls do not have udders. To show you what kind of a design oversight this is, allow me to demonstrate just how wrong it is. I am the human equivalent of Otis. See what I mean? By the way, this is the ideal male body. You may not like it, but this is what peak performance looks like. And, okay, if you can look past that, you can look past that. The worst part of this show isn't even something in the show, though. Like, if the movie didn't exist, this show would actually be better, because seeing what the premise of the show became makes it insulting to the movie, which was actually a good movie. I'm not gonna spoil the movie because, seriously, go watch it, it's good. You'll be glad you did. But don't watch the show after the movie, because the way the movie ends, you'll be insulted and possibly even offended by the show. Yeah, I'm kind of speechless after what I've seen. I'm done here. Have a good one.